The morning sun had only just risen when Malachi Boone noticed the silence pressing against the walls of his cabin. It was not the gentle stillness of dawn, nor the natural quiet of prairie winds settling. This was heavier, sharper, like the world was holding its breath. He stepped toward the window with a coffee mug trembling between his fingers, and what he saw nearly made him drop it. Hundreds of men stood along the fence line of his modest ranch. They were arrayed in perfect order, their painted faces lit by shafts of sunlight feathers shifting slightly in the breeze. Not one spoke, not one shifted in his saddle. Their presence was like a living wall, a barrier of muscle and iron will. 200 at first glance, no more. Some still rode in from the hills, filling gaps until the horizon itself seemed edged with warriors. Malachi's chest tightened. He had been alone for years, a young rancher with little to his name, but a few horses, a patch of land, and a cabin his father had built. A man inexperienced in most things, especially women. The townsfolk called him the Virgin Rancher, half mocking, half pitying, as though inexperience with love marked him a child unready for manhood. Yet here he was staring down an army, his knees weak beneath him. And all of it, every silent gaze, every unreadable expression, was because of something he had done less than 24 hours ago. The storm yesterday had come fast, a black curtain sweeping across the plains, lightning tearing jagged wounds in the sky. Malachi had been out in the corral, checking the latch on the gate, before the wind snapped it loose when he saw her. A figure emerging through the rain, her buckskin dress clinging to her frame, her long black hair plastered to her face. She moved like a deer half-wounded, every step a struggle against exhaustion and fear. He hadn't thought. Instinct drove him forward. "Ma'am, you'll catch your death," he shouted above the storm boots, sinking into the mud as he rushed to meet her. When she turned, the first thing he noticed was not weakness, but the fire in her dark eyes. Fear, too, but not of him. Fear of something unseen beyond the tree line. "I cannot stay," she said, her voice nearly drowned by thunder. "My people will be searching." The accent in her words was soft, careful, as though she weighed each syllable. She looked behind her again, dread etched into every motion. Malachi had no idea who she was, nor why she was alone in such weather. But his mother's lessons still echoed in his bones. Help the stranger share what you can never turn away someone in need. So he shrugged off his thick wool jacket, the one patched at the elbows, the one that had once kept his father alive through winters so brutal cattle froze on their feet. He placed it around her shoulders without hesitation. The change in her expression startled him. She looked down at the coat as though it were not cloth and thread, but treasure. Then her eyes lifted back to his, and for a moment the storm itself seemed to vanish. Her lips curved not the polite smile of a stranger passing, but something deeper. Something that pierced into him with a warmth he did not understand. "You would give this to me," she whispered. "Only till the storm passes," he stammered, cheeks burning. "You're freezing." She drew the jacket tighter and spoke her name, Ayana. Then she repeated his when he offered it, Malachi Boone, rolling the syllables as though engraving them into memory. Before he could gather courage to offer her the safety of his cabin, she slipped back into the night, swallowed by rain and darkness, leaving him with questions that rattled louder than the thunder. He did not know then that a single act of kindness had just set fire to fates larger than his own. He did not know that the jacket draped across her shoulders carried meanings far older than he could guess. He only knew that when dawn broke, warriors came. First dozens, then hundreds, their numbers swelling until his ranch was encircled. And at their head rode a man taller than the rest, his headdress marked with eagle feathers, his presence commanding the silence like a general marshalling an army. When the stranger dismounted and stepped forward, Malachi's legs threatened to betray him. He wanted to reach for the rifle above his hearth, but he knew one bullet meant nothing against hundreds of bows and spears. So he stood bare-handed on his porch, the wood creaking beneath his boots as the man's dark gaze fell upon him. "Malachi Boone," the man said. Not a question, a statement. He already knew. "Yes, sir," Malachi managed, voice tight. "I am Dakota chief of these people. We have come for the woman." The words struck harder than any blow. Malachi felt his throat tighten. The woman. The chief's stare sharpened. "The one you sheltered. The one who wears your jacket." Malachi's blood ran cold. Ayanna. She hadn't returned to them. His gesture, his thoughtless kindness had somehow bound him to her in a way he didn't comprehend. Now hundreds of warriors waited for his answer, the morning sun glinting off their weapons, silence heavy as judgment. "I meant no offense," Malachi said weakly. She was cold. "I only." But Dakota's voice cut him off low and heavy as a hammer striking stone. "Do you know who she is?" Malachi swallowed hard. "She told me her name. Ayanna. That's all." The chief's eyes narrowed, his face unreadable. "She is my daughter." The revelation hit Malachi like a thunderclap. The daughter of a Lakota chief. No wonder the plains had erupted in warriors. No wonder every gaze at the fence line was filled with suspicion. In their eyes, he was the last man to see her before she vanished. To them, he was not a rescuer. He was the only witness or the only suspect. The silence pressed closer, and Malachi understood one thing with sick certainty: the kindness of yesterday had become the trial of today. For a long moment, Malachi could not breathe. The chief's words rang in his ears, echoing like thunder trapped inside his skull. Ayanna, daughter of Dakota. The very woman to whom he had given his jacket, the very woman who had disappeared into the storm. And now 200 warriors stood silent at his fence because of her absence. His lips parted, but nothing came out. His mouth was dry, his tongue heavy. Finally, in a whisper that felt too small for the weight of the moment, he managed, "I didn't know." Dakota studied him, expression carved in stone. Behind the chief, the wall of warriors did not shift, but Malachi could feel their scrutiny burn against his skin. It was as though every painted eye judged him, every silent face measured his soul. "You gave her your coat," the chief said. "She did not return to camp. Tell me why." Malachi's stomach twisted. He thought back to that night, the rain, the thunder, the way Ayanna had clutched the jacket as if it were sacred. He had offered her shelter. She had refused, said her people would worry. And then she had vanished into the blackness. "I swear to you," Malachi said, forcing steadiness into his trembling voice, "I only wanted to help. I told her she could keep it until the storm ended. She left before I could stop her. That's all." The chief's eyes narrowed. He took one step closer, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath the weight of his presence. "If you speak truth, then prove it." Malachi blinked. "Prove it." Dakota's voice dropped low and dangerous. "You will ride with us. You will show us where she went, where you last saw her. Until we find her, your life is tied to hers." The words landed like shackles around his chest. Malachi felt his knees weaken. Ride with them into the wild unknown, surrounded by men who could end his life with a single glance, yet he also understood the truth. Refuse, and he would never live long enough to argue his innocence. Accept, and at least he had a chance, slim though it was. "I'll help," he said quietly. Dakota nodded once. The decision was final. Around them, warriors shifted for the first time since dawn. Horses stamped the ground, leather creaked, and the wall of silence broke into movement as preparations began. A small column of 50 men would ride with the chief. The others would remain their presence, hemming in Malachi's ranch like prison bars. Inside his cabin, Malachi moved with shaking hands. He saddled his horse, strapped his father's old rifle across his back, and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him in childhood. His reflection in the small cracked mirror startled him, eyes wide with fear, jaw tight with resolve. A boy had looked back at him yesterday. A man faced him today, whether ready or not. By mid-morning, the search began. Dakota rode at the front, his bearing regal, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. Malachi followed close, every step of his horse, weighed down by dread. The warriors flanked them, a tide of disciplined riders whose silence was more terrifying than any battle cry. They began at the corral where Malachi had first seen Ayanna. Dakota dismounted, crouched low, and scanned the ground. His hands traced the earth as if it were a page written for him alone. "She passed here," he murmured, her steps heavy on the left. "Injured." Malachi's heart clenched. Injured, he hadn't noticed in the rain, too blinded by the storm and the pull of her eyes. Guilt pressed against him. And here, Dakota continued, pointing to another set of impressions in the mud. Boots. Larger. Following her. The words chilled the air. Malachi looked down, but saw only churned earth. To his untrained eyes, nothing distinguished one patch of mud from another. But the chief's certainty was absolute. "She wasn't alone," Malachi said softly. Dakota's jaw tightened. "No. Someone drove her from her horse, forced her to run. Someone who wanted her weak." His gaze lifted toward the hills. This was no accident. It was planned. The column pressed on. Hours passed as they trailed faint signs across the prairie. Bent grass here, a snapped twig there. Each clue Dakota uncovered deepened the weight in Malachi's chest. With every mile, the truth grew clearer. Ayanna had been hunted. By noon, they reached the river. Its banks were swollen from last night's rainwater, rushing brown and swift. Dakota dismounted again, crouched low, and touched the mud. His voice was grim. "She crossed here." Not willingly. Her steps too far apart, someone forced her faster than she could bear. Malachi's breath caught. The image rose unbidden, Ayanna stumbling, driven forward by unseen hands, pain twisting her face. His fists clenched until his nails cut his palms. "There are horse tracks on the far side," Dakota added, eyes narrowing. Waiting. This was no chance pursuit. It was organized. The implication was undeniable. Whoever had taken her had planned it well, horses ready, trail covered by the storm, everything arranged to vanish without trace. And then Malachi saw it. Hanging from a low branch above the riverbank, caught against the current's pull, was something familiar. worn fabric sodden and dark swaying in the breeze. His jacket. He spurred his horse forward, heart hammering. The sight nearly stole his breath. The coat he had given Ayana tied deliberately to the branch, as though left for someone to find. She placed it here, Dakota said, voice quiet but steady. A sign. She wanted us to know this was the path. But as Malachi drew closer, a darker realization struck him. The jacket wasn't simply caught by chance, it had been tied carefully, deliberately. And in its pocket was a scrap of bark tucked with purpose. Dakota pulled it free, eyes scanning the charcoal marks etched across its surface. When he spoke, his voice trembled with rage. It says the daughter pays for the father's crimes. Sunset tomorrow or she dies. The words sliced through Malachi like a blade. Sunset tomorrow. Barely more than a day. A clock had begun ticking each hour, dragging Ayana closer to death. What crimes? Malachi asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Dakota's eyes darkened. Old grudges. A warrior I defeated last winter, Akasheta. I spared his life. He swore he would take from me what I held most dear. Now he makes true his vow. Malachi felt the weight of it settle like a millstone on his chest. He had stepped into a conflict far older and more dangerous than he could imagine. What had begun as a kindness in a storm was now a race against time, against betrayal, against the merciless wilderness itself. The sun rose higher. The river churned. And in Malachi's chest, a single truth pounded with every heartbeat: to survive, to clear his name, and to honor the woman who had smiled at him through rain, he would have to become someone he had never believed he could be. The message burned in Malachi's mind long after Dakota had tucked the bark away. Sunset tomorrow or she dies. It was more than a threat. It was a trap carefully baited. And he, the outsider, the virgin rancher, who had lived his life in quiet obscurity, now found himself tangled in a web spun by warriors and betrayals far beyond his reckoning. The column pressed on their horses' hooves, beating a steady rhythm against the soaked earth. Malachi rode near Dakota, feeling the weight of every glance from the warriors behind him. They did not trust him. Why should they? To them, he was the last man to see Ayana alive, and now he rode among them, armed with nothing but a rifle he barely knew how to use, and a heart that thudded too loudly in his chest. As the prairie opened before them, Dakota broke the silence. There are 3 men in my band who sought my daughter's hand before she vanished. I denied them. His voice was flat, but beneath it simmered a tension Malachi could feel in his bones. 3? Malachi asked, wary. Dakota nodded. Kitchi, young and reckless, believes his skill in the hunt entitles him to whatever he desires. Chaitan, older, patient, dreams of leading my people when I am gone. And Maddo, violent, quick to anger a man who cannot accept rejection. Malachi's throat tightened. He turned in his saddle, scanning the warriors. They all looked formidable. Their faces painted, their bodies lean with muscle. Which of them carried betrayal in his heart? Which of them would sell Ayana to her enemies? Dakota's gaze swept his men with a weight that silenced even the wind. If one of them has betrayed us, I will know. But I will not accuse without proof. That is why you are here, White Rancher. They will not guard themselves against your eyes. Watch them. See what I cannot. Malachi nodded, though fear trembled in his gut. What chance did he have of detecting deceit among men raised in a culture he barely understood, yet Takota's trust, or perhaps his demand, left him no choice. By afternoon, the trail grew more treacherous. They entered a canyon, its walls towering high shadows stretching long across the ground. The air felt heavier here, charged as if the stones themselves held secrets. Malachi's unease deepened with every step. Then it happened. An arrow hissed from the cliffs above, striking sparks off stone. Another followed, then another, until the canyon rang with a whine of shafts and the cries of warriors. Horses reared, men shouted, and chaos erupted. Malachi dove from his saddle, rolling into the dust as arrows thudded into the ground where he had stood. His heart pounded, each beat a hammer in his chest. The warriors around him scattered for cover, loosing arrows, upward their war cries echoing against the stone. Through the chaos, Malachi's eyes caught something that froze his blood. Kitchi, the young, reckless one Takota had named, was not taking cover. Instead, he crouched in the open hands, flashing in a series of sharp gestures toward the cliffs. Signals. Coordinated signals. Takota, Malachi shouted, pointing. "It's him. Kitchi's with them." The chief's eyes followed his gesture, narrowing as realization struck. Without hesitation, Takota drew his bow and loosed a single arrow. It flew true, striking Kitchi's shoulder and sending him sprawling. The trader's cry was swallowed by the thunder of hooves and the clash of men. The revelation turned the tide. Takota's loyal warriors roared with fury, redoubling their assault. The ambushers faltered, their surprise undone by the chief's swift justice. Yet the battle was far from over. The canyon walls spat arrows like venom, and the narrow space below offered little shelter. Malachi pressed himself against a boulder, breath ragged. He was no warrior, no fighter. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his rifle. But then, amid the storm of sound, he glimpsed something, a flash of buckskin, high above, half hidden behind the rocks. His breath caught. Ayana. She was bound, gagged, her dark eyes wide with fear, yet blazing with defiance. She struggled against her captors, but the ropes held fast. "She's up there," Malachi cried, pointing frantically. "North wall, 50 yards." Takota turned, saw, and his face darkened. Too exposed. "They'll kill her before we reach her." But Malachi was already moving. He scrambled toward the rock face, hands clawing for holds, boots slipping against stone slick with dust. He had never climbed more than the rafters of his own barn, but desperation lent him strength. Behind him, the battle raged, arrows clattering like hail. His lungs burned, his arms ached, yet he climbed. Higher and higher, until his hands bled from the stone's bite. Every time he glanced down, the canyon swirled dizzying beneath him, but he pressed on. Because Ayana was up there. Because he could not bear the thought of doing nothing while she suffered. At last he hauled himself onto the ledge. She lay before him, wrists bound, gag, muffling her cries. Her eyes widened as he cut her free, and when the cloth slipped from her lips, she gasped his name. Malachi. Relief surged through him, so fierce it nearly knocked him back. "You're safe now," he whispered. "Your father is here. We'll get you out." She shook her head, urgent. "It was Kitchi. He told Akacheta where to find me. They planned this." Malachi's gut twisted. He had seen it himself, the traitor's signals. Proof undeniable. Yet even as he freed her, the sounds of battle below reminded him they were far from safe. The ledge ended in sheer drops. The only way down was the path he had climbed, and enemy eyes scoured every inch of the canyon. "There's another way," Ayana whispered fiercely, pulling at his arm. "A hidden trail. Follow me." To his astonishment, she moved with agility even after her ordeal, leading him along a narrow crack in the stone. The path wound treacherously, but it brought them down behind the enemy's position. There, crouched in the shadows, they saw him, Akasheta, the man who had sworn vengeance, directing the ambush with ruthless precision. Malachi's hand trembled on his rifle. He had never fired in anger, never pointed a weapon at another living man. But before he could decide, Ayana reached for the gun. Her eyes were steady, her grip sure. "Give it to me," she said. He hesitated, then handed it over. In one fluid motion, she settled into position, sighted along the barrel, and fired. The crack of the shot echoed like thunder. Akasheta staggered, a bullet in his thigh, collapsing with a roar of rage. The battlefield shifted instantly. His men faltered, leader, wounded, their advantage shattered. Dakota's warriors surged forward, their cries fierce, and the ambushers broke beneath the weight of their assault. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent, save for the groans of the defeated. Malachi stood beside Ayana, chest heaving, the rifle still warm in her hands. For the first time, he realized she was not simply the chief's daughter, not simply a woman in need of rescue. She was fierce, capable, every bit her father's child. And together they had turned the tide. The echoes of battle still clung to the canyon walls, lingering like ghosts. Smoke curled from smoldering arrows, wedged into rock, the metallic tang of blood mixed with the sharp scent of dust and sweat. Dakota's warriors moved among the fallen, binding the wounded and gathering weapons, their movements efficient, honed by years of survival. Malachi leaned against the rock-faced chest, heaving. His arms still trembled from the climb, his knees weak, yet his eyes never strayed far from Ayana. She stood tall, despite her torn dress and bruised wrists, her face streaked with grime, but alight with the fierce strength of one who had stared down death and refused to yield. Dakota approached, bow still in hand, his expression unreadable. He stopped before Malachi, and Ayana, gaze shifting between them. For a moment, silence stretched heavy as stone. Then, the chief spoke, his voice low, but carrying to every ear. "You climbed a canyon wall for my daughter." Malachi swallowed, unsure how to respond. He could feel the weight of 100 eyes upon him, warriors watching with the same mixture of suspicion and something else, something edging toward respect. "I couldn't just stand by," he said finally, voice hoarse. Dakota's eyes narrowed, studying him as though searching for cracks. At last, he inclined his head. That took courage. The words were simple, but from the mouth of a Lakota chief, they carried the weight of a blessing. Around them, the warriors murmured, their earlier hostility tempered by what they had witnessed. Malachi felt heat rise to his cheeks, unsure how to carry the sudden shift. He was no hero. He had acted from desperation, from fear of losing Ayana, from a need he barely understood. Yet here he stood, recognized by men who had once looked at him as an enemy. Kitchi, wounded but alive, was dragged before the chief. Blood darkened his shoulder where Dakota's arrow had struck his face, twisted in pain and defiance. He spat at the ground, eyes burning. "You betrayed your own, Dakota," said voice like iron. "I sought only what was rightfully mine," Kitchi snarled, glaring at Ayana. She should have been mine. I would have led with her at my side. Instead, you cast me aside like a dog. Dakota's hand tightened on his bow, fury flashing across his features. But before he could speak, Ayana stepped forward. Her voice steady, despite the tremor of exhaustion, rang clear. You sought not me, but power. You would have chained me to ambition I did not share. You are no warrior, Kitchi. You are a coward? The words struck harder than any arrow. Kitchi's face twisted, his pride pierced deeper than his flesh. Dakota gestured, and his men hauled the traitor away, binding him with rawhide. Justice would come later, harsh and final, as it always did among the people of the plains. For now, there was no time to dwell. Dakota turned to his men. Akasheta still breathes. He will answer for his crimes. They dragged the wounded warrior from behind the boulders, his legs soaked with blood where Ayana's bullet had found him. Even in defeat, his eyes blazed with hatred. He spat curses in his native tongue, railing against Dakota, against Ayana, against all who stood in his way. You will not hold power long, old man, he hissed through clenched teeth. Others will rise. Your people will see you cannot protect your own blood. Dakota's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. Instead, he signaled his men to bind Akasheta alongside Kitchi. Betrayers and enemies both would face judgment at dawn. As the camp settled, fires were lit in the canyon shelter. Warriors tended wounds, shared low voices, their eyes still flicking toward Malachi with a mix of caution and reluctant approval. Malachi sat apart the events of the day, spinning through his mind like a storm. He had climbed, fought, survived, but for what he was still a stranger in their world, still the outsider who had stumbled into a struggle not his own. Ayana approached quietly, her steps light despite her ordeal. She lowered herself beside him, the fire casting her face in warm light. For a long while, they sat without speaking, the crackle of flames filling the silence. At last, she said softly, "You risked your life for me." Malachi looked at her, words caught in his throat. I couldn't watch you suffer. That's all." Her eyes searched his, and he felt again the weight of her gaze, the same intensity he had seen in the storm. It was not the look of a woman merely grateful for kindness. It was deeper, sharper, as though she saw in him something he could not yet see himself. "You are not as you think," she whispered. "You believe yourself weak, untried. But today you proved otherwise." Her words stirred something within him, a warmth mingled with fear. He wanted to believe her, yet part of him clung to doubt. Still, her presence at his side steadied him as though the storm of his heart found anchor in her calm. Across the fire, Dakota watched them, his expression unreadable. Malachi felt the weight of the chief's gaze and wondered what judgment lay behind it. Did he see a foolish boy entranced by his daughter's smile, or a man who had begun to earn a place among them? Night deepened. The canyon filled with the soft murmur of warriors at rest, the occasional whinny of horses, the sigh of wind through stone. Malachi lay awake, long after others had closed their eyes, staring at the stars pricked into the velvet sky. He thought of the jacket, the simple act that had started all of this. A gesture of kindness, nothing more. Yet to Ayana, it had been something greater, and to her people, it had become a bond carrying the weight of honor and fate. What was he now? Malachi Boone, once mocked as the virgin rancher of the plains, he had climbed a wall of stone-faced arrows and betrayal, and stood before warriors without flinching. But was it enough? Tomorrow would bring judgment? Tomorrow, he would face not just suspicion, but the question of where he belonged. As sleep finally claimed him, Ayana's words echoed in his mind, "You are not as you think." And for the first time in his life, Malachi wondered if she might be right. The dawn that followed broke clean and sharp, the sky painted in hues of rose and gold. The canyon, scarred from the night's violence, seemed eerily peaceful in the morning light. Fires had burned low, their smoke curling upward like pale ribbons. Dakota's warriors stood checking weapons, tending horses, preparing for the long ride back. Malachi rose stiffly from where he had slept against the stone. His body ached in every muscle, reminders of the climb, the fight, the weight of fear that had pressed him down. Yet there was also something new, an ember of resolve that refused to die out. He had survived. More than that, he had stood where others might have fled. The prisoners were brought forth. Kitchi, pale and sullen, kept his head bowed, his once arrogant eyes now hollow with defeat. Akachita, though bound and bleeding, still radiated defiance. His jaw set, his glare fixed on Dakota with venom. The two men represented different shades of betrayal, one born of lust and pride, the other of vengeance and ambition. Dakota addressed his warriors, his voice carrying across the canyon like the toll of a great bell. Justice comes at dawn. These men chose treachery, and treachery has but one end. The warriors murmured their agreement, a sound like distant thunder. Malachi felt the weight of it, the stark finality of justice in this land. There were no courts, no written laws. Here, survival itself was the law, and betrayal was paid for in blood. Yet when Dakota turned to him, Malachi was unprepared. "You will bear witness, Malachi Boone. You gave my daughter your coat, and by that act, you bound yourself to this story. You will see it finished." Malachi swallowed hard, but he nodded. He could not refuse. The executions were swift, brutal, and without ceremony. Kitchi, the traitor within, met his end with a last scream of rage. Akachita, proud, even in defeat, spat curses until the final moment silenced him. When it was done, the canyon echoed with a silence deeper than before, a silence that felt like a grave. Malachi turned away, bile rising in his throat. He had never seen death dealt so coldly, so decisively. Yet the warriors around him accepted it as the natural order, as necessary as the rising of the sun. In their eyes, this was not cruelty, it was balance restored. Ayana approached him, after her face solemn. "This is our way," she said softly, as though reading his thoughts. "It is hard, but it is what keeps us alive. Without justice, there is only chaos." He met her eyes, searching for anger, for sorrow, but found only a quiet strength. She had endured more than he could fathom, and still she stood unbroken. In that moment, he realized he was not looking at a woman defined by danger or victimhood. She was a warrior in her own right, carrying her people's burdens with grace. The ride back to his ranch was slow. The column stretched across the plains like a river of flesh and spirit. Where yesterday the sight of so many warriors had filled him with dread, today he felt something different. Not safety, not yet, but a thread of belonging, tenuous and new. When at last they crested the hill and his homestead came into view, the sun dipped low, bathing the land in copper light. The fence line was still guarded warriors, standing watch, but now their posture was different. No longer accusing, no longer waiting for blood. Instead, There was recognition, a silent acknowledgement of what had been endured together. Dakota reined in his horse before the cabin. He turned to Malachi, his face solemn, carved deep by years of leadership. "You risked your life for my daughter," he said, "and you uncovered betrayal among my men. For this, you have earned respect." Malachi shifted in his saddle, uneasy beneath such weight. "I only did what I had to. I didn't want her to suffer." The chief's gaze softened slightly. Sometimes that is all courage is. Doing what must be done when the heart demands it. Then Dakota raised his voice, addressing his warriors. "From this day, Malachi Boone is no longer a stranger. He is a friend of our people. He is welcome in our camp as one of us." A murmur of assent swept through the gathered men, low but powerful. Malachi felt his chest tighten, a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. Just days ago, he had been a lonely rancher, mocked as inexperienced, untested. Now he was being honored by men whose respect was hard-won, perhaps harder than gold. Ayanna dismounted and came to stand beside him. She still wore his jacket, its fabric torn and stained, but draped around her shoulders with quiet pride. She looked at him, her dark eyes luminous in the fading light. "You should take this back," she said gently, slipping a hand over the worn collar. But Malachi shook his head. "Keep it. It looks better on you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the sigh of the wind across the plains. Then Ayanna smiled, that deep soul-reaching smile he had first seen in the storm. The sight of it stirred something inside him, something that whispered of new beginnings. The warriors began to disperse, some riding toward the horizon, others making camp nearby. Dakota lingered only long enough to clasp Malachi's arm in a gesture of final respect before turning his horse and leading his people away. Soon the ranch stood quiet again, the fence no longer lined with painted faces, the land once more his own. Yet Malachi knew it would never be the same. He was not the same. The man who had trembled at his window, clutching a coffee cup as 200 warriors stared him down, was gone. In his place stood someone who had faced fear, climbed stone, defied death, and found in the eyes of a chief's daughter a reason to be more than he had ever believed possible. As the last rays of sun bled into twilight, Malachi stood at his fence, watching the horizon where Ayanna rode with her father. His jacket fluttered at her shoulders, a banner of connection between their worlds. And though the prairie stretched wide and uncertain before him, for the first time in his life, Malachi Boone did not feel alone. He felt chosen. He felt ready. And somewhere deep within, he knew that one storm-born kindness had altered not just his fate, but the balance between two peoples forever.